Hello, this is Nikki Going. Welcome to part 2 of our introductory session to the Crucible. This is the second session out of 10 in which we discuss Arthur Miller's wonderful play, The Crucible. To start with, I'm just going to give you an overview of how these talks are structured. So in session 1, I talked to you about introductory content and the background to the play. In this session, I will continue with the introduction and tell you more about the background. In the next session, I will discuss the first half of Act 1, and in session 4, I will finish our discussions of Act 1. In session 5, I will cover Act 2. In session 6, I will talk about the first half of Act 3, and in session 7, I will complete Act 3. In session 8, I will discuss Act 4, and in session 9, I will tell you how you can go about writing really good essays on the Crucible. In session 10, I will discuss how to answer contextual questions on the Crucible, and hopefully these 10 sessions will set you up to perform really well in the exams. Bear in mind that because this is structured as a series of 10 talks, if you need to go back and review something, you always can. You can stop the content and have a read through the slides if you need to. And if I'm telling you something you already know or that you don't think is particularly relevant, you can fast forward it. So just to recap what we covered in session 1, I told you about the basic plot of the play. I pointed out that the Crucible is actually a tale of more than one trial. On the face of it, it's just about the Salem witchcraft trials, but we come to know that in fact it's about other trials as well. I talked to you about the Puritans' history and how their background and their own story had led to the tragedy of the Salem witchcraft trials. And we discussed the physical and psychological setting of the play, because that's really important in terms of what motivates the characters. We also discussed Puritan attitudes, the attitudes towards evil, towards children, towards women, and towards witches and witchcraft. I gave you an overview of the way that Miller has structured the plot of the play, and I talked to you about his attitudes and focus on historical accuracy. And then finally, I talked to you about power and reputation and the impact that the obsession with power and reputation has on the events in the play. In today's session, I'm going to give you an overview of the characters, and I'm again going to be referring back to the impact of power and reputation and how that results in the characters taking the actions that they do. I'm going to suggest a few ways in which you can read and interpret the play. I'm going to discuss why the Crucible was relevant in the 1950s and why it is still relevant today. I'll talk about the themes that are linked and run throughout the Crucible, and then I will leave you with some things to think about as you read. So if we start off with the characters and an overview of the characters, remember what Miller said about his characters and about the way that he structured this play. He said this play is not a history in the sense in which the word is used by the academic historian. Dramatic purposes have sometimes required many characters to be fused into one. The number of girls involved in the crying out has been reduced. Abigail's age has been raised. While there are several judges of almost equal authority, I have symbolized them all in Hathorne and Danforth. The fate of each character is exactly that of his historical model, and there's no one in the drama who did not play a similar, and in some cases exactly the same, role in history. They may therefore be taken as creations of my own, drawn to the best of my ability in conformity with their known behavior, except as indicated in the commentary I've written for this text. So always bear in mind that Miller based his characters on people that actually lived and breathed and suffered in the 1600s. But where it suited his dramatic purposes, he made changes, because his main purpose in writing this play was not to simply record and retell history. It was to comment on history, and perhaps even more importantly, to comment on how he saw history actually repeating itself in America of the 1950s. So before we start talking about the characters, I would like you to think about power and what an important feature of this play power actually is. And Miller comments on power dynamics in the Society of Salem, and also how the various characters are able to manipulate others so that they can either increase their power, or if they stand by their integrity and refuse to compromise themselves, how they lose power. I'd like you to think how at the start of the play, different characters have different amounts of power. And if you have a look at this diagram with this triangle and think of it as a power hierarchy with the most powerful characters at the top and the least powerful ones at the bottom, think about where you would put the various characters in the play at the start of the play, and then where they move to during the course of the play. And if you're thinking about who has power and who doesn't, things to consider are things like gender, age, race, religious belief and how Puritan they were considered to be in their society, wealth or land ownership, and then who their ancestors were, because that was also an important part of gaining status or losing status in Salem. And you will notice that I refer to these features throughout when I discuss the individual characters. Also think about what it is that characters need to do in order to change their position on this power hierarchy. And you'll notice that as we talk through the Crucible in the next 8 sessions, I will quite often bring this slide up and show you where and how characters have moved around. And then if you're thinking about how and why this play is relevant in modern day South Africa, you can also think about what gives people power in South Africa today in terms of gender, age, race, religious beliefs, wealth and ancestry, and where you would put various people in South Africa on this power hierarchy. So when we talk about the characters in the Crucible, we can see that they fit into various social classes, and I'm going to discuss them in order from those at the bottom of the power hierarchy towards those that are right at the top. So at the bottom of the power hierarchy, you'll notice that you have all female characters. So at the very bottom, you've got the outcasts. These are people like Tituba, Sarah Good, Goody Osborne, and Bridget Bishop. People that have slightly more power than them, largely because of their families and because they haven't yet developed a terrible reputation, are the children. So those are people like Betty Paris, Ruth Paris, Betty Paris, Ruth Putnam, Abigail Williams, Mary Warren, Mercy Lewis, and Susanna Walcott. Those that have more power than the children are the wealthy landowners and their wives. Notice that it's at this stage that male characters start coming into the picture. And here we have John and Elizabeth Proctor, Thomas and Anne Putnam, Francis and Rebecca Nurse, and Giles and Martha Corey. But notice that within those relationships, the women, the wives, would have always had less power than their husbands. Above this group of people on the power hierarchy, you have the reverends, the ministers of the churches. So these are Reverend John Hale, who comes from the village of Beverly, and Reverend Samuel Paris, who is the minister of the Salem Meeting House. Probably slightly above that, or possibly on a par, are the officers of the Salem court, and they were also all male. So that's Ezekiel Cheever and Marshall Herrick. Notice that Samuel Paris made sure that he was elected as an officer of the Salem court once the witchcraft trials got started, because that elevated him on the power hierarchy. And then right at the top, in control of all of Salem society, you have the judges of the Salem court, and naturally they were all male. So there was Judge Hathorne and also the deputy governor of the state of Massachusetts, who was Deputy Governor Danforth, who was also elected as a judge to the Salem court. So remember always that there is a link between characters and plot, because characters carry out certain actions because of how they are motivated to behave, and that drives the plot along. Now, in this play, we already know what is going to happen because the play is based on historical fact. And we know for a fact that many people were found guilty of witchcraft and hanged in Salem in 1692. So the interest in this play doesn't lie in will they or won't they get hanged. We know they probably will. The interest lies in why the events in Salem happened. So Miller creates a small world, a microcosm, in which he looks at what motivates human beings to round on one another and to accuse one another of terrible crimes and have one another punished. So he analyzes the motives of the various characters, and he uses the play as a way to explore why and how people behave the way that they do. So as you read, you need to ask yourself why each character behaved in the way that they did. For example, you could ask yourself the question, is Abigail just a powerless girl woman who's trapped in a patriarchal, chauvinistic, misogynist society where all she can do to defend herself against a charge of witchcraft is to accuse others? Or is she a cold-blooded sociopath, someone with absolutely no mercy, no compassion, no feelings for others, who uses the witchcraft trials very deliberately to gain power and to eliminate enemies, particularly the wife of her lover, John Proctor? So I'm going to work through the characters now in order, and as I do, think about where they would sit on that power hierarchy and why, and whether or not they are able during the course of the play to gain power, or if they lose power and why that happens. So the first character we're going to look at is the character of Tituba. Now, Tituba was a black slave woman who was owned by Reverend Paris. She originally came from the island of Barbados, where she'd been captured as a slave, and she had converted to Christianity. Now, as Paris's possession and as a person of color, a woman and a slave, she had absolutely no rights and therefore no power in Salem society. The people of Salem would have seen her as far more likely to be sinful or to commit witchcraft because she came from the Barbados. And they saw the Barbados as a place where people practiced exotic, ungodly, heathen forms of religion, in Puritan terms, devil worship. And the fact that she was reputed to have helped the girls make love potions and to have conducted a seance to call up the spirits of Ann Putnam's dead babies wouldn't have helped their view of her. You'll notice that during the course of the play, she confesses to witchcraft and she gets jailed. Unlike Abigail and the other girls who confess to witchcraft and become powerful officers of the court. By Act 4, Tituba is driven mad, and then we hear no more about her. So you can read the character of Tituba as a very sad commentary on what happened to people of color in this Eurocentric colonial society, and how no matter who they sided with, they remained powerless and they remained bullied and persecuted. Other social outcasts that never gain any power in the play are Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good, and Bridget Bishops. And they were all social outcasts that the people of Salem initially used the witchcraft trials as a way of actually cleansing their society of them, because they had done things like being promiscuous, sleeping with multiple men, being alcoholic, being homeless, and sleeping in ditches. Now, I know we wouldn't normally consider being homeless or being forced to sleep in a ditch to be sinful, but if you remember the Puritans' attitude towards evil, they usually believed that when bad things happened to people, it was because they were not good people. They'd earned their bad luck in some way. Right, next in terms of power are the children. So these are Betty Paris and Ruth Paris are the youngest children. And that should, Ruth Putnam, not Ruth Paris. So Betty Paris is Reverend Samuel Paris's daughter. She's about 10 years old at the time of the play. Her mother had died, so she lives with her father and her orphaned cousin Abigail Williams. And since Paris discovered her and the other girls dancing in the forest, she has been behaving very strangely. She seems to be conscious, but she doesn't move, speak, or eat, and that's why the people of Salem think she's bewitched. The historical Betty Paris had fits and these strange periods of screaming and hallucinating that had gone on for weeks, and that was why in history the people of Salem thought that Betty Paris was actually possessed. And she goes on to become one of the main accusers in the trials, even though she's only a 10-year-old child. Ruth Putnam is the Putnam's daughter. She's probably about 12 years old in the play. She has similar symptoms to Betty and was also seen dancing in the forest. And in addition to that, she had asked Tituba to conjure up the spirits of her dead siblings so that they could find out whether or not her siblings had been murdered by means of witchcraft. Other important child characters, although they are actually teenagers bordering on grown women, are Abigail and Mary Warren. So Abigail Williams is Reverend Paris's niece. In the play, she's about 17 years old. The historical figure of Abigail was actually much younger, but Miller made her older for the purposes of the play because he didn't want to present Proctor as a paedophile, because that's not the point he's trying to make. Abigail is an orphan, and so she lives with her Uncle Paris. She's extremely beautiful, she's extremely manipulative, and she spends the whole play lying. She was Elizabeth Proctor's servant, but she was fired because she had an affair with John Proctor. And she becomes the court's star witness before she steals her uncle's life savings and runs away from Salem. Mary Warren is another servant girl in the village. She's a servant to the Proctors, so she actually takes Abigail's place as the Proctor's servant. She's probably about the same age as Abigail. She seems to be incredibly lazy. Whenever we see Mary Warren, she's trying to avoid housework. And she becomes an official of the court. And when she's an official of the court, she testifies against her friends in the first half of Act 3. But by the end of Act 3, she testifies against Proctor, and she in fact testifies that he's a witch. So she is ultimately the reason that he lands up getting hanged. Mercy Lewis is another servant girl. She's a servant to the Putnams and looks after their daughter Ruth. She's probably about the same age as Abigail, maybe a little bit younger. And Miller's stage directions describe her as fat, sly, and merciless, which means, I think, that he was making a little pun, an ironic joke about her name. And she flees Salem along with Abigail in Act 4. Susanna Walcott is another one of Abigail's friends, probably about the same age or possibly a little younger. Next in the power hierarchy are the wealthy landowners, and they have power because they have money, because they have land, because they have good reputations, and they are usually pillars of the Puritan Church. So we'll start with John Proctor, who was a wealthy farmer and a main character in the play. Miller describes Proctor as tactless. He says he's a strong character that refused to tolerate fools. And because of this, he's greatly respected, but he also has a lot of enemies in Salem. And Proctor's got a problem because he has this reputation for integrity that really, really bothers him because he cannot stand hypocrites. And he knows he's committed adultery with Abigail Williams. So as far as he's concerned, he is a hypocrite. And he spends the first half of the play basically hating himself for his hypocrisy and for the fact that he betrayed his wife and he hurt her feelings, and he feels incredibly guilty. He initially underestimates how manipulative, angry, and dangerous Abigail is, and her desire to take Elizabeth's place as Proctor's wife is actually what drives the witchcraft trials, along with the fact that Proctor and all of the other male characters completely underestimate her and underestimate the other children, which is a theme that runs throughout the play. So although Proctor ended his affair with Abigail by the time the play starts in Act 1, in Act 1 he does actually admit that he still has feelings for her. He says, "I may think of you softly from time to time." He's still attracted to her. But by the end of Act 3, he realizes that Abigail is trying to kill Elizabeth, and he absolutely hates her. He's accused of witchcraft, and initially he decides he's going to confess and live. But then he decides not to confess and to die instead. And in the process of confessing and destroying his reputation and no longer feeling like a hypocrite, he's able to forgive himself and regain his self-respect and his integrity. Just note that the real John Proctor was actually 60 years old, and he never confessed. And he was like John Proctor in the play, he was also hanged. Elizabeth Proctor is John Proctor's wife. Between her and John Proctor, they have 2 sons. And Elizabeth represents the forces of good and heaven acting on Proctor's soul. So sometimes she seems a little bit too good to be true, but I think that is because she symbolizes the forces of good and heaven. She's often described in terms of color imagery, where she's described in terms of whiteness. And she's also described metaphorically as being cold and wintry. You'll notice that it's usually Abigail who says that Elizabeth is cold and wintry, whilst Abigail describes herself as having a sense for heat and is often described in terms of red color imagery. So this is Abigail setting herself up as being different and in opposition to Elizabeth. But it is also Miller illustrating that Abigail and Elizabeth are opposite characters. Elizabeth represents heaven, Abigail represents hell and temptation and sin. And the imagery of the play also reinforces the fact that these opposite characters are going to fight for their relationship with John Proctor, for control of him and his soul. In Act 4, Elizabeth actually says that she was a cold wife. She says it takes a cold wife to prompt lechery, and she partly blames herself for Proctor's affair with Abigail. She later on forgives Proctor for his adultery and declares her undying love for him. She's accused of witchcraft, but she's spared because of her pregnancy. And again, the character of Elizabeth is based on a real person. Then we come to the Putnams. They're also wealthy landowners. So Mr. Thomas Putnam, he's bitter, he's angry, he feels that he doesn't get the respect he actually deserves from the people of Salem. And he feels that he deserves this respect because he comes from a very old family that actually fought against the Native American Indians in Nangarret. He owns lots and lots of land. And when he chose Salem's minister, the Salem congregation actually disregarded his choice and they elected Paris instead. So he's bitter and he wants revenge before the witchcraft trials even start. He's often in disputes with his neighbors about land ownership, and we see that during the course of the play, he uses the trials so that he can get people convicted of witchcraft, because once they're convicted of witchcraft, their land is then taken over by the state. The state auctions the land at very low prices, and Putnam has the money to buy that land. So he actually used witchcraft accusations as a way of increasing the size of his farms. Anne Putnam is his wife. She's a pillar of the community in the Salem religious congregation, but Miller describes her as a twisted soul of about 45, death-ridden and haunted by dreams. And she's death-ridden and possibly twisted because she gave birth to 8 babies, of which 7 died. And of course, in these times, the Puritans didn't have scientific or medical explanations for the death of so many babies, so they put it down automatically to witchcraft. And now her 8th child, Ruth, seems to be getting very withdrawn. She's weakening. And so Mrs. Putnam, in desperation, she says, sends Ruth to Tituba to ask Tituba to conjure up the spirits of Ruth's dead siblings so that she, Mrs. Putnam, can find out how all of her babies died, because she suspected that they were murdered by supernatural means by a witch. And she eagerly sides with Abigail in the court, and she was also based on a real-life character. Rebecca Nurse is another wife of a respected landowner, Francis Nurse. She was an elderly lady that had 27 children and grandchildren. So you can see why Goody Putnam absolutely hated her and was so jealous and envious of her. Rebecca Nurse had a lot of common sense and an excellent reputation for being charitable and being a model Puritan woman. And throughout the play, she seems to represent the voice of common sense. So if you want to know what Miller is thinking, it's usually a good idea to look at what Rebecca Nurse is thinking. She sees looking for witches as dangerous, and she says that when you look for witches, you cause conflict in the community. And she has a different view of evil to most of the people in Salem, because to Rebecca Nurse, evil is not an external force personified by the devil. She saw evil as actually being part of everyone. And she said that if evil is actually happening in Salem, the people of Salem needed to examine their own behavior and then ask God for help. They shouldn't be accusing others of witchcraft and deflecting the blame. And it turned out that she was very wise, because that's exactly what they did. She is based on a real character who was also hanged for witchcraft. So if you go to the village of Salem today, you can actually see her tombstone in the graveyard. Francis Nurse was her husband, wealthy landowner, a pillar of the Salem meeting house. And the Nurses are friends and neighbors to the Proctors, and they've been in conflict with the Putnams for a very long time. So you can see why the Putnams were behind the accusations of witchcraft that were made against the Nurses. The Coreys were another wealthy land-owning farming family. So Giles Corey is described by Miller as being naive, but basically a good person. Martha Corey is his third wife, who he married later in life. And when he married her, he became far more religious than he'd ever been before. And so it was probably only when he married her that he started learning how to pray. He's always fighting with his neighbors over land, so you can see why he later gets accused of witchcraft. And when he's accused of witchcraft, he refuses to admit or deny the charges. And the court orders that he gets pressed to force him to confess. And pressing is when they put big stones on his chest. And eventually his rib cage actually broke and his lungs were punctured, and he died saying the words, "more weight." And because he died from pressing without actually admitting to or denying witchcraft, his land was not inherited by the state, so his children could then go on and inherit it. So you can see what a stubborn and brave man he was. Martha Corey was another pillar of the Salem community in the Salem church. She actually taught Corey how to pray. She was charged with witchcraft by another farmer, George Walcott, because she sold him a pig that later died. The reason the pig died wasn't because of witchcraft, it was because Walcott was too stupid to actually keep it alive. But he charged her with witchcraft in revenge because his pig died. And Corey, her husband, actually gave the court further evidence to convict her of witchcraft by mistake, because he'd asked Hale at the beginning of the play very innocently why it was that he struggled to pray when she was reading her books. And obviously it was probably because he didn't know his prayers very well, and if she was reading her books, she wasn't helping him to say them. Right, then there are two reverends in the play. Reverends are, I suppose, the Protestant equivalent of a priest. So they lead the Salem meeting house or the Salem church. These are Reverend Samuel Parris and Reverend John Hale. Reverend Samuel Parris is the Puritan minister of Salem Village. And you'll see that he constantly feels threatened and insecure. He's desperate to keep his job, to the point where he seems to be more worried about his job than he is about his daughter Betty. Before he became a minister, he was a merchant. He's incredibly greedy and insists on having gold candlesticks in the church. He fights about his pay in a very un-Puritan-like addiction to materialism. He becomes a chief supporter of the court and its prosecutions until his life is threatened in Act 4, and then all of a sudden he starts begging Danforth to postpone the hangings. So you can see that what is consistent about Parris is that he always acts in his own best interests. And he was also based on a real-life character. Reverend John Hale is a Puritan minister from the neighboring village of Beverly. He's famous because of his knowledge of witches, which he's studied in detail. He's presented as a fair-minded man who maintains his integrity throughout. He had actually previously proved that a woman in Beverly who'd been accused of witchcraft wasn't even a witch. And from that we can tell that he's not absolutely determined to prove, that as many people were witches as he possibly could. He was genuinely looking for the facts as he understood them. And as the play progresses, he gradually loses faith in his religious faith and in the courts. And he too was based on a real-life character. Then we have the officers of the courts. These are Ezekiel Cheever and George Herrick. So Ezekiel Cheever actually was a tailor. He made people's clothes, and then he became a clerk of the court. He writes warrants, he takes records, he supervises arrests. And ironically, and in becoming a clerk of the court, he acts against neighbors and the people in the village of Salem that he's known for his entire life. And he represents those people that go along with the law because it's the law, even when they know that what is being done is not actually just. George Herrick is the town marshal. I suppose he's the 16th century equivalent of the chief of police. He arrests people on behalf of the court and he runs the town jail. By Act 4, he's drinking heavily. He's based on a real person called John Willard, who in reality lost complete faith in the court, refused to arrest any more people, and became an alcoholic. And Willard was eventually charged with witchcraft and hanged. And then finally we come to the judges, who are at the pinnacle of that power pyramid. So there is Judge Hathorne, who's a senior justice of the Salem court. He's one of the two judges in the play. And he seems to have absolutely blind faith in Abigail and the girl's testimony. And so he's a key figure behind all the convictions and the hangings. Judge Danforth was also the deputy governor of Massachusetts and the chief justice of the court, which is why people keep referring to him as Excellency. He refuses to admit that Abigail and the girl's evidence is flawed, no matter what evidence is put in front of him. He carries on refusing to admit that they are dishonest and the evidence is flawed, even when he has absolute proof, because Abigail stole all of Paris's money and she ran away with Mercy Lewis. And from this, we can conclude that he probably only wants to cement his reputation and that of the court. He's based on a real-life character, Magistrate William Stoughton, who convicted most of the people that were hanged in the real-life Salem witch trials. And Miller said that Danforth is the real villain of the play, which is quite interesting because we tend to think of Abigail as being the real villain of the play. Right, so one of the things I'd like you to think about is, by the end of the play, where would you put all of the characters that we have discussed on this power pyramid? Notice that the previous factors that determined power haven't changed. Gender, age, race, religious belief, wealth, ancestry haven't changed. The only new factor that could be manipulated to bring about or lose power is characters' willingness to confess to witchcraft and to accuse others. So that was the agent of change that shifted people around in society in terms of their power. Now, some technical terms. The protagonist is the main character in a play, novel, or a film. They suffer the most hardship and undergo the most change in the course of the story. Obviously, if we're reading The Crucible, the protagonist is John Proctor. The antagonist is the person who opposes the main character in the play, novel, or film. And the word antagonist comes from the ancient Greek meaning to struggle against. So if we think about who struggles against Proctor, who poses the greatest obstacles and difficulties for him, definitely Abigail, and probably also people like Danforth and Putnam and Paris. Flat characters are uncomplicated characters that don't change during the course of the play. They're not usually main characters. So be careful of saying that Elizabeth Proctor is a flat character, because although she remains good throughout the play, her attitude towards Proctor does actually change subtly. And then rounded characters are characters that are as complex and complicated as real people because they change, because they develop. So main characters are generally rounded characters. So your main characters in this play are definitely John Proctor, Elizabeth Proctor. I would argue that Abigail Williams is a rounded character. Although she remains evil, she actually grows into her power. She grows into her manipulation, and she does keep changing her story towards the court. Okay, motives are the reasons why characters do things or act in a certain way. So as you read and think about each character, decide if they're flat or round. We've talked about who the antagonists and protagonists are. See if you can add to that list. Think about the motives for the character's behavior. And always remember that the characters in the Crucible, although based on real life people, are not strictly historically accurate, because that wasn't Miller's primary concern. So some characters are variations or combinations of real life people, some characters are inventions. Now I'm going to tell you about a few ways in which you can actually read the play. So you can read this play as a tragedy in the sense of an ancient Greek tragedy. You can read it as a morality play. You can read it as a great love story. And even though it's so tragic and so dark, I would argue that it is one of 20th century literature's greatest love stories. And you can read it as an illustration of how fear, love, and hatred can be used to manipulate power. So, if we're looking at whether or not this play is a tragedy in the sense of an ancient Greek tragedy, we have to ask ourselves, is John Proctor a classical ancient Greek tragic hero? Now, in ancient Greek tragedies, tragic heroes start off as powerful and possibly heroic, and the audience is able to admire them from the beginning. And it's important because you want the audience to sympathize with what later happens to them. So if the audience finds nothing to like, they're unlikely to sympathize. Your tragic hero has a tragic flaw. It's often pride that makes them partly responsible for their own downfall and destruction. They suffer a dramatic change in fortune, where their fortune goes from good to bad, and this causes a high point of tension or a climax in the plot. And they learn something because they make some important discoveries, usually about themselves, sometimes about other characters. They die at the end of the play and they are punished, but the way in which they are punished for their fatal flaw usually seems to be completely excessive. So, let's ask ourselves, does John Proctor actually tick these boxes? Is he a noble hero at the start? Well, a traditional audience would admire him because he's a pillar of the Salem church in the community. He stands up to the bullying of the Putnams in Paris, and he ends his relationship with Abigail because he wants to be true to his wife. But a more feminist 21st century audience might also see him as a chauvinistic, misogynistic adulterer, and on that basis they might not be able to stand him. Does he have a fatal flaw? Well, certainly he has great pride in his integrity and his reputation. He has a lack of self-control which led to adultery. But you've got to ask yourself, is this flaw so great that it should actually have led to his death, that it should have been fatal? Does he suffer a dramatic change from good to bad fortune? Well, you can argue that when Proctor was about to convince the court that he and Abigail had committed adultery, that would have ended the trials. It would have saved Elizabeth from further prosecution. So it looked like his fortune was good, but then Elizabeth was called in to testify, and she lies, ironically, to save his reputation. And that lie is the basis upon which Danforth chooses to ignore Proctor's evidence and to continue to believe Abigail. So that, you can argue, is a dramatic change in fortune from good to bad. But we can counter-argue that Proctor actually realizes at this point how much he and Elizabeth love each other, and they regain their relationship. So there is also a counter change in fortune from bad to good. Does he have learning through an important discovery? Once Proctor has sacrificed his reputation to save Elizabeth, he realizes how much he loves her and he's been forgiven by her, and then he discovers that he still has some integrity, and he learns that he would rather die than lose his integrity. So that's his dramatic learning, the fact that he actually has integrity and he is worthy to die as a martyr in these trials. But he does leave his confession of adultery until it is too late to actually have an impact on the court. So one wonders whether he did, in fact, learn all that much, or if he wasn't just forced into it. And finally, a tragic hero suffers punishment and death at the end. And Proctor is hanged because he refuses to allow a false confession to be displayed in public on the meeting house door. So that could be argued that, yes, that ticks that box. But the counter argument is maybe he was just hanged because he was too proud to lie, and this wasn't really a punishment for any kind of nobility. So another way that you can read this play is whether or not it is a morality play. Now, morality plays are plays in which you have a main character that is affected by a conflict between opposing forces of good and evil. Specific sub-characters represent those forces of good and evil, and the main character eventually has to choose a side. This results in a moral lesson or warning being delivered. So let's see whether or not the Crucible ticks these boxes. So do we have a main character affected by a conflict between the forces of good and evil? Our main character is Proctor. He's tempted to continue his adulterous affair with Abigail. He's not entirely honest with Elizabeth at the start of the play. And we can see that Abigail is in constant conflict with Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth eventually wins Proctor back. So yes, there does seem to be this conflict between the forces of good and evil, and they affect the main character. You have specific sub-characters that represent good and evil. So Abigail is the main character that is an evil influence on Proctor, whilst Elizabeth is a good influence. And Rebecca Nurse also represents a good influence. So we could argue that certainly the play ticks that box. The main character eventually has to choose a side. Well, we know that Proctor eventually loses all of his positive feelings for Abigail when he understands that she's been trying to murder Elizabeth. And he also realizes that Elizabeth is the great love of his life, which, as I said, makes this an incredible love story as well, that moment when Proctor chooses a side. And is the play structured to deliver a moral lesson or warning? I think you can argue that Miller writes this play and structures this play so that it warns of the dangers of a literal and metaphorical witch hunt, and it warns of the dangers of following any faith or ideology unquestioningly. Now, you can also look at the play and the plot of the play in terms of change, and you will notice that the plot is structured in terms of a dropping down of something whilst something else increases at the same time. So if we look at power, as Proctor loses his power, Abigail gains hers until that comes to an abrupt halt in Act 3 when she runs away and leaves Salem. You can look at it in terms of Proctor's love. As Proctor loses his love of Abigail, which obviously comes to an end in Act 3 when she runs away, he gains his love of Elizabeth. And then you can look at it in terms of Hale's religious faith and his faith in the court. As Hale loses faith in God and by extension the court and the Puritan meeting house, he gains an understanding of the corruption and the evil that people are capable of. And you can see how the one leads to the other. Right, now another question that you need to ask yourself is, why is the Crucible relevant today? I mean, let's face it, it was written about an event that happened 400 years ago on another continent. So why would a 21st century audience be interested in a play about witchcraft and witchcraft trials? I mean, who believes in witchcraft these days? Well, you'd be surprised. People are still literally persecuted and sometimes even killed because their communities believe that they are actually witches. As recently as 1990, a South African, Mr. Benedict Dazwa, who was a school teacher, a principal, a highly educated man, was murdered in Limpopo province because his community thought he was a witch. You might be interested to know that the Catholic Church has subsequently declared that he is a Catholic saint. So if you think of a witch hunt as a group that systematically persecutes someone by making accusations that will destroy their reputation, here I'm talking about a metaphorical witch hunt, even if they're not proved guilty, then you know that witch hunts still happen. They happen on a regular basis in our schools, in our communities, and in our political structures. So today, the accusations that destroy lives and reputations aren't usually accusations of witchcraft, but there are equivalents. So think of those accusations that will completely wreck a person's reputation, even if they are not proven to be guilty. These are accusations of things like bullying, sexual harassment, pedophilia, abuse, or racism. And Miller investigates how people make accusations, whether it's of one of the things listed above, or witchcraft, or in the case of 1950s America, of being a communist. He investigates how people make accusations so that they can gain power, and why people in their society go on to believe those accusations. And he investigates the impact on any society of a government that divides its people into groups and then gives them absolute labels. So, for example, good and bad, us and them. And in Miller's case, patriotic Americans, evil communists. Which brings us to why the Crucible was relevant at the time in which Miller wrote it, in the 1950s. So Miller wrote The Crucible and published it in the USA in 1953. At the time, America was dealing with the end of World War II, and it had started its Cold War with the USSR. Many Americans were terrified that Joseph Stalin, who was the communist leader of the USSR, was going to actually take over the entire world, and that he would then force all countries, including the USA, to become communist countries. And a leader in this way of thinking was Senator Joe McCarthy in America, and he convinced many members of the American public and the American government of the time that communism was a huge threat to capitalism and the American way of life. And that campaign of instilling fear of communism in the Americans was known as the Red Scare, because another name for communists was Reds, because the communist flag and the color usually associated with communism is red. So here's some anti-communist propaganda from the USA in the 1950s, and you can hear the fear and paranoia behind the language. Americans, don't patronize Reds. You can drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. This tract will tell you how. Why we must drive them out. The Reds have made our screen, radio, and TV Moscow's most effective fifth column in America. And it goes on to list the reasons why in the 1950s, as a good American, you were patriotically bound to be terrified of communists and do everything you could to stop them. So Miller saw Senator Joe McCarthy lead a series of anti-communist witch hunts where Americans suspected of sympathizing with communism or being communists were actively persecuted, and they were persecuted through the court system. So you can see the parallel to the Salem witch trials. The anti-communist witch hunts led by McCarthy's House Committee for Un-American Activities, which was sometimes called HUAC, questioned and prosecuted writers, artists, and intellectuals. They really focused a lot on Hollywood. Many people lost their jobs and were blacklisted so that no one else would then go on and employ them. And some Americans were even jailed and were given criminal records, which meant that they couldn't get work once they'd been released. So The Crucible is a political allegory that Miller used to satirize the corruption that he saw in his society in the late 1950s. What's an allegory and what's satire? I hear you cry. I'll explain. So an allegory is a story where the events and characters in a play or a literary work make a comment about real world people and events. So when Miller wrote The Crucible, he wasn't just talking about 16th century Salem. He was talking about contemporary America as well. And a satire is the use of techniques that include humor, mockery, irony, sarcasm, and often other figures of speech as well, to criticize social institutions and or political processes. So one of the things that Miller was satirizing was the way that justice was or wasn't being applied in America in the 1950s. So many of Miller's friends were questioned and blacklisted. Miller was even asked to adapt one of his scripts so that the baddies, which were gangsters, weren't gangsters but were communists. And he said this was ridiculous, and he point blank refused. He was called up in front of HUAC, the House Committee, and was asked to name other communists, and he refused to name communists. and he was eventually punished by having his passport taken away. He was given a massive fine and sentenced to 30 days in prison. Later, all of that punishment was overturned, but it must have been quite frightening for him at the time. So Miller hated Senator Joe McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunts, but he couldn't openly criticize McCarthy because that would have given McCarthy everything he needed in order to find Miller guilty of being a communist. Much like Salem, the situation in Salem, one couldn't criticize McCarthy's courts without being seen as a communist sympathizer and anti-American. And he didn't want to be accused of being an anti-American communist sympathizer. So what he did was he wrote about the Salem witch trials in the 1960s. Because he realized that the Salem witchcraft trials operated in a very similar way to McCarthy's anti-communism trials in the 1950s. And so he could write The Crucible and criticize his own society, his own political structures, without being prosecuted, because if they had prosecuted him, he could have just gone, what? I wrote about something that happened 400 years ago. Bit sensitive? No. So in Miller's own words, what he later said about this period of his life was, in our lives, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the left could not look straight at the Soviet Union's abrogations of human rights. The anti-communist liberals could not acknowledge the violations of those rights by congressional committees. Nobody but a fanatic, it seemed, could really say all that he believed. So even the most liberal people, the left in America, could not actually acknowledge that the communists had committed human rights violations, and the most conservative people, those on the side of McCarthy, could not acknowledge that the congressional committees were violating human rights as well. So McCarthy's trials had completely polarized American society. So why else is the Crucible relevant in the 1950s? According to Miller, he says the Crucible was an act of desperation. By 1950, when I began to think of writing about the hunt for Reds in America, I was motivated in some great part by the paralysis that had set in among many liberals who, despite their discomfort with the Inquisitors' violation of civil rights, were fearful, and with good reason, of being identified as covert communists if they should protest too strongly. So he felt he had to protest, but the only way he could do it was under the cover of an allegory. So what did the Salem witch trials and the anti-communism trials have in common? Well, both trial processes created an atmosphere of extreme fear and paranoia. In both cases, accusing others made the accusers very, very powerful. Naming others, if you were accused, was generally the only effective form of self-defense. The evidence used in both sets of trials was very badly flawed. The court's star witnesses often had obviously corrupt motives for making their accusations. For example, in the McCarthy trials, they were often bribed, and what they had in common with the Salem witchcraft trials was that many of the witnesses were terrified, they were ambitious, they wanted vengeance, they were greedy, so they had all sorts of negative motives for making accusations. And in both sets of trials, you had a powerful personality leading the trials. In Salem, it was Abigail Williams, and in America in the 1950s, it was Senator Joe McCarthy. And the trials damaged social order. They caused huge, huge chaos in their societies at the time. People felt completely unsafe because they knew that if they weren't actively and visibly collaborating with the courts, there was a good chance that they could be accused of being against the courts. And this, of course, led to great tension and suspicion in those societies. And if you just look at this propaganda poster from the 1950s, look at the fear in that. Is this tomorrow America under communism? You know, and there you've got communists grabbing women, and it looks like they're about to rape them because, of course, anyone that you are opposed to had to be hell-bent on rape. So Miller points out that in the 1950s, the communists under Stalin were as afraid of the Americans as the Americans were of the communists. So in communist USSR, you had similar propaganda. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures to show you, but there was a lot of similar propaganda. And so Miller explores the idea that people tend to see themselves as good and anyone different to them as opposite to them and therefore evil. So it's that thought pattern where we polarize society, where we see it in dualistic terms of good and evil, heaven and hell. And he says, in the countries of the communist ideology, all resistance of any import is linked to the totally malign, that should be capitalist ideology. And in America, any man who is not reactionary in his views is open to the charge of alliance with the red hell. Political opposition thereby is given an inhumane overlay, which then justifies the abrogation of all normally applied customs of civilized discourse, or civilized intercourse. So what he's basically saying there is that it's human nature to identify anyone as different to ourselves as being evil. And once we've labeled people as evil, it's okay to do whatever we like to them because they're evil, and therefore any means is justified to the end of getting rid of them. And that kind of mentality can also be seen in this World War II propaganda stamp. So here, the enemies are identified as the USSR and Nazi Germany. And this stamp came out before the USSR joined the Allies at the end of World War II. And look how serving on the side of the Allies is seen as a godly act. The ultimate issue of the war is God or anti-God. So Miller does start analyzing the advantages of patriotism, and he does acknowledge that there are some advantages to the social system in the USSR of the time. He points out that the strict religious beliefs and an autocratic, theocratic style of leadership helped the people of Salem to survive. And notice that that social order in Salem is actually quite similar to the social order in the USSR at the time. So in both Salem and the USSR, there was an unquestioning loyalty to an ideology. The people of Salem did not question Puritanism and their theocratic government, and the people of the USSR did not question communism. Both societies had a total obedience to the orders given by an autocratic government, and both societies had a belief that the good of the community always took priority over individual needs. And Miller describes how this actually served the Puritans well when they first settled in the USA. He says how the profit-motivated settlers in Virginia didn't survive, but the Puritans, by contrast, did, even though Massachusetts had a much harsher climate. And he says, Massachusetts tried to kill off the Puritans, but they combined. They set up a communal society, which in the beginning was little more than an armed camp with an autocratic and very devoted leadership. It was, however, an autocracy by consent, for they were united from top to bottom by a commonly held ideology whose perpetuation was the reason and justification for all their sufferings. So their self-denial, their purposefulness, their suspicion of all vain pursuits, their hard-handed justice were altogether perfect instruments for the conquest of this space so antagonistic to man. So in short, theocracy, autocracy kept the Puritans unified, and it helped them to survive. It wasn't a bad thing to begin with. But he then goes on to critique patriotism. And remember, patriotism is that quality of being completely supportive and devoted to one's country. Usually seen as positive, but where it's unquestioning, it can have some pretty negative outcomes. So Miller talks about the birth of democracy in the USA. And he says that Puritanism was not only a strength for the people of Salem, it was also a weakness. He said their struggle to survive led to an army camp type mentality where they survived because every person just obeyed the laws of their society without question, and no one challenged the authority of the Puritan church and government. But then, as they settled into their colony and they started to feel safe, there were people like Proctor, for instance, who questioned the need for this absolute obedience, and then you got tension. And he says that the witchcraft trials were a natural backlash against that tension and against that questioning. And Miller says that the questioning of authority was actually the birth of democracy in the USA. And he says, eventually the time came in New England when the repressions of order were heavier than seemed warranted by the dangers against which the order was organized. In among all classes, when the balance began to turn towards greater individual freedom. So now we come to the themes in the Crucible, and they are all linked to this idea of power and who has power and how is power best actually used and how is it manipulated and abused. So remember, a theme is an important idea that's repeated, discussed, or runs throughout a work of art or literature. And themes are usually linked to specific imagery. And as I discuss the themes throughout the play, you'll see that they're in red at the top of the slides. And very often I make the link with the imagery that is used to actually represent those themes. Imagery is visually descriptive or figurative language used to make a work more interesting or vivid for a reader or audience. So some of the themes in the Crucible, as I said, usually in red at the top of a slide. We see the tension between reputation and integrity throughout the play. And of course, that's linked to who has power in Salem and who doesn't. Because having power depends on having a good reputation. Having integrity sometimes involves losing one's power and reputation. And of course, that's linked to the inversion of, or the turning upside down of the social order which happened in Salem, which is linked to layers of truth and reality in Salem, because obviously people with no integrity were manipulating the truth. It's linked to the dangers of faith in faith, and I would argue the dangers of faith in ideologies and patriotism as well, which is linked to Miller's satirizing of the accusations made in the McCarthy trials. And he uses that to highlight how he satirizes the evidence that was accepted in the Salem witch trials, which is linked to the motivations for the witchcraft accusations. And of course, people believed those witchcraft accusations because they had this dualistic worldview that applied to most people in Salem. And of course, that resulted in them underestimating children, which meant that Abigail was relatively free to persecute Elizabeth. And of course, we see that playing out in this theme of the battle between Abigail and Elizabeth for the soul of John Proctor, which of course is a symbol of the supernatural battle between the forces of good and evil, because remember that this can also be read as a morality play. So you want to pay careful attention to how the plot, characters, and themes are linked. And in Miller's words, hopefully you will discover, as he says, I believe that the readers will discover here the essential nature of one of the strangest and most awful chapters in human history. So as you try and discover that strangest and most awful chapter in human history, I'd like to just give you a few questions to think about. So ask yourself, do we still see the world in an oversimplified and dualistic way? What is the best system of government and why? Is it possible to have power and use power without being corrupted in that process? Who are the powerless members of your society, of our South African society? Are people who are powerless in society morally justified in using violence, dishonesty, or corruption to bring about a more fair and equal distribution of power? So if you think about those questions before you start reading the play, and then you read the play before you start listening to the talks about the acts, I think you will get the most possible that you can out of the talks that follow. I would advise that you read an act, watch the talk on the act, and then reread the act, but it's up to you how you tackle it. Thank you very much, and I will see you for session 3.